The planet Velcaris Prime was nothing but ruins now. Once a great world of warriors, it had become a graveyard of history. Ancient stone towers, broken statues, and forgotten battlefields stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with dust, and the winds carried whispers of a war long lost. Jonah Calloway stepped carefully over cracked stone, his boots crunching against the brittle remains of a once mighty empire. He was no ordinary treasure hunter. He was an archaeologist, an explorer of the past. His team had spent weeks digging through the ruins, searching for lost artifacts of the Hypharian Empire, a race of warriors feared across the galaxy. Most believed that Velcaris Prime had nothing left to offer. The Hypharians had vanished centuries ago, and their weapons were either destroyed or buried too deep to find. But Jonah wasn't convinced. Legends spoke of one final relic, an artifact of great power hidden beneath the sands, a weapon that had belonged to Queen Salith, the last ruler of the Hypharians. And now, standing before the entrance of an ancient war chamber, Jonah felt it. Something was here. The chamber was dark, its walls lined with carvings of warriors and battle scenes. Strange symbols glowed faintly, reacting to Jonah's presence. His fingers brushed against the smooth stone as he moved forward, his breath slow and steady. Then he saw it. At the center of the chamber stood a black pedestal, and embedded within it was a massive sword. The blade was unlike anything he had ever seen. Dark metal with veins of silver, its edges sharp despite centuries of rest. The hilt was wrapped in an unknown material, and at its center lay a crimson gem, pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. Jonah swallowed hard. "The Queen's blade," he whispered. This was it, the weapon of Queen Salith, a warlord so feared that her own people had sealed her away, locking her power inside this sword. No warrior had ever been able to wield it since. The legends claimed that only the worthy could awaken its power. Jonah knew he should report the discovery. This wasn't just any artifact. It was something beyond understanding. But as he stepped closer, he felt an unexplainable pull, a whisper in the back of his mind urging him forward. His heart pounded. His fingers twitched. Then, without thinking, he reached out and touched the hilt. The moment his skin made contact, the air shattered like glass. A deep rumble shook the chamber, dust falling from the ceiling as ancient mechanisms activated. The symbols on the walls flared to life, casting the room in eerie blue light. A powerful shockwave erupted from the sword, sending Jonah staggering backward. Pain shot through his arm as the blade's energy coursed through his veins. His mind suddenly filled with visions, flashes of war, of soldiers kneeling before a queen in silver armor, of a blade cutting through enemies like lightning. He gasped, gripping his head as the images overwhelmed him. Then, just as suddenly, the visions stopped. Jonah looked up at the sword. It was no longer embedded in stone. It was in his hand. The weight of it was perfect, as if the sword had been made for him. The crimson gem at the hilt glowed brighter, and the veins of silver pulsed with newfound energy. Jonah's breath was shaky. He had done something impossible. Then, a sound echoed through the chamber. A voice, cold, furious, and ancient. Across the galaxy, in a place long forgotten, a prison deep in space trembled. A woman's eyes snapped open, glowing with rage and power. Queen Salith had awakened. Her connection to the sword had been restored. And the moment she sensed who had taken it, her fury burned hotter than 1,000 suns. "A human," she whispered, her voice filled with venom. "Unforgivable." Far away, standing in the ruins of Velcaris Prime, Jonah shivered. Though he didn't know it yet, he had just made an enemy of a queen who had once conquered entire worlds. And now, she was coming for him. Cold shiver ran down Jonah's spine as he looked at the sword in his hand. The queen's blade, a weapon that had slept for centuries, had chosen him, a human. The chamber was silent, yet he could feel an invisible presence, as if the very walls were watching him. The ancient carvings along the stone glowed faintly, responding to the sword's awakening. The air felt heavier, charged with something powerful. Jonah's fingers tightened around the hilt. It was perfectly balanced, not too heavy, not too light, as if it was made just for him. The crimson gem in the hilt pulsed like a heartbeat, and a strange warmth spread through his arm. He took a deep breath. What had he just done? Suddenly, the ground rumbled. The pedestal where the sword had been embedded cracked and collapsed, sending dust and debris into the air. Jonah stumbled backward, coughing as the dust clouds surrounded him. Then, a sound pierced the silence. A distant scream, filled with rage. It wasn't from the chamber. It wasn't from this planet. It was something far away, yet terrifyingly close. Jonah's vision blurred, and in an instant, he was somewhere else. A dark chamber, deep in the void of space. The walls pulsed with energy, ancient and powerful. In the center of the chamber, a woman stood, her body encased in a strange metallic cocoon. Her long silver hair floated as if she were underwater, and her eyes were closed, as if she were sleeping. Then they snapped open. Queen Salith, the last ruler of the Typharian Empire, had awakened. She gasped, her body shaking as she felt the connection restored, the connection she had lost centuries ago. "The sword," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She clenched her fists, feeling the energy of her weapon once more, but something was wrong. The connection was different. The sword was no longer hers. It had chosen another. Then she saw it. Through the sword's vision, she saw him. A human. A mere mortal, standing in the ruins of her empire, holding her blade as if he had any right to it. Silith's eyes burned with fury. Unforgivable. The chamber shook with her rage. The ancient prison that had held her for centuries began to break apart. The failsafe that kept her trapped weakened, because the sword had never been meant to be separated from her for so long. And now, with the bond broken, her return was inevitable. She lifted her hand, and the metal cocoon around her shattered. Jonah's vision snapped back to reality. He gasped, stumbling against the broken pedestal, his head pounding from the strange experience. What was that? Who was she? The sword pulsed in his hand, as if it knew. Before he could process anything, his earpiece crackled to life. "Jonah, do you copy? What's happening in there?" We felt a tremor outside. It was Dr. Lane, the leader of the excavation team. Jonah quickly pressed the earpiece. I'm fine. But something's happened." He glanced down at the sword. Should he tell them? Would they even believe him? Before he could decide, another violent tremor shook the chamber. This time, it wasn't from the ruins. It was something larger. He rushed toward the exit, heart pounding. As he stepped outside, his breath caught in his throat. The sky above Velkaris Prime was changing. Dark clouds swirled unnaturally, moving faster than any storm Jonah had ever seen. The winds howled, and the air itself seemed to vibrate. Jonah had seen enough strange things in his lifetime. But this was different. Then, in the distance, a crack in the sky. A massive tear in the fabric of space itself ripped open, like a wound in the universe. Lightning-like energy surged from it, spiraling outward. Jonah felt his chest tighten. He knew what was happening. She was coming. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of space, aboard the Grand Council chambers of the Typharian High Council, alarms blared. A council member, his face lined with age and wisdom, stared at the readings in front of him. His hands trembled. "No," he whispered in horror. He turned to the others. "Queen Salith is awakening. The failsafe has failed." The room fell silent. Then another council member spoke, her voice grim. "Who freed her?" The screens flickered, displaying a single image. A human man, holding the sword. The room erupted into chaos. One council member slammed the table. "We cannot allow this. If she regains her power, the galaxy will burn again." Another spoke, voice urgent. "We must send forces immediately. Both the human and the queen must be eliminated before it's too late. The decision was made. Kill the human. Destroy the sword. Stop the queen at any cost. And across the stars, Salith smiled. She could feel the council's fear. It was delicious. But there was only one thing on her mind: finding the human, and taking back what was hers. Jonah's heart pounded as he watched the sky split open. A tear in space had formed above Valkyrie's prime, releasing a dark storm that spiraled across the heavens. The wind howled, carrying a strange energy that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. He gripped the queen's blade tightly. The sword's crimson gem pulsed, as if it could sense what was coming. Then his earpiece crackled again. "Jonah, get back to the ship. Now." Dr. Lane's voice was sharp with urgency. Jonah turned toward the excavation site. The research team was already running toward their small transport ship, parked near the ruins. Equipment was left behind. No one cared about artifacts anymore. They had felt the tremors. They knew something wasn't right. Jonah took a step forward, then stopped. A shadow moved within the storm. His breath caught as he saw figures emerging from the rift in the sky. At first, they looked like distant shapes, but as they descended, he could see them clearly: warriors. Their silver armor gleamed under the storm's light. Their eyes burned with violet energy. They carried long spears and blades made from a metal Jonah didn't recognize. He knew who they were: the Sci-Fi elite. They had come for him. Across the galaxy, aboard the Sci-Fi Council's flagship, a transmission was sent to all warships. A high-ranking officer, standing before the council, bowed deeply. "The order is confirmed. We will retrieve the sword and eliminate the human." One of the council members, an elder with cold eyes, nodded. "And what of the queen?" The officer hesitated. "She will not stop until she reclaims the blade. If she succeeds." Silence filled the room. They all knew the truth. If Queen Salith regained her full strength, she would unleash war upon the galaxy once more. Finally, the elder spoke. "Then we must make sure neither of them survives." Jonah clenched his jaw as the Typharian warriors landed on the ruins. They moved like trained predators, their weapons humming with energy. One of them, a tall figure in ornate silver armor, stepped forward. His helmet retracted, revealing a scared face with piercing violet eyes. He spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "Human, you hold what is not yours. Surrender the blade." Jonah didn't move. He could feel the sword in his hand, its power humming through his veins. His mind flashed back to the moment he had first touched it, to the visions of war, of Queen Salith, of betrayal. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a legacy, a symbol of power. Jonah tightened his grip. "No." The warrior's eyes darkened. "Then you die." In an instant, the Sci-Fi warriors charged. Jonah's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body acted differently. The moment the first warrior lunged, the sword moved on its own. With inhuman speed, Jonah sidestepped the attack, his blade flashing as he parried. Sparks flew as metal met metal. His muscles burned, but something guided him, not his mind, but the blade itself. A second warrior lunged from behind. Jonah ducked, twisting just in time to avoid the deadly spear aimed at his chest. He spun, striking with a fluid motion that sent his attacker crashing to the ground. He had never fought like this before. Somehow, he knew what to do. The sword wasn't just bonded to him, it was teaching him. But the warriors weren't fools. They regrouped quickly, surrounding him in a circle. Their leader raised his spear. "You cannot win, human. You fight like an amateur." Jonah's breath was heavy, but his grip on the sword didn't loosen. Then, the storm above them twisted. A new presence descended from the sky. The Sci-Fi warriors froze. Jonah turned, his stomach tightening as he saw her. A figure in black and silver armor, her long silver hair flowing behind her, her violet eyes glowing with raw fury. She landed on the ruins with unnatural grace, her boots barely making a sound. Her expression was unreadable, but the sheer power radiating from her sent a chill down Jonah's spine. Queen Salith had arrived. Her gaze swept over the scene, the fallen warriors, the sword in Jonah's hands. Then her eyes locked onto him. Jonah felt his breath stop. The moment stretched in silence. Then, in a voice as cold as the void, she spoke. "That does not belong to you." Jonah swallowed hard but stood his ground. "It chose me." Salith's expression darkened. It had no right. She raised her hand. Without warning, a force slammed into Jonah, sending him crashing into a broken stone pillar. He gasped as pain shot through his body. The air knocked from his lungs. The Sci-Fi warriors quickly knelt before their queen, their heads bowed in fear and respect. Salith didn't even glance at them. Her entire focus was on Jonah, who struggled to get back on his feet. "You are no warrior. You are a thief." She took a step closer. "And thieves are punished." Jonah coughed, wiping the blood from his lip. He knew he couldn't win against her. Not now. He had to run. The sword pulsed in his grip. It seemed to agree. Then, a new sound filled the air, the roar of engines. Jonah's eyes flicked toward the sky. His team's transport ship was hovering above the ruins, its cargo door open. Dr. Lane's voice echoed in his earpiece. "Jonah, jump. Now." Salith's eyes narrowed as she realized what was happening. Jonah didn't hesitate. With the last of his strength, he sprinted toward the ship, using the sword's power to propel himself into the air. Just as the Queen's energy blast shattered the ground where he had been standing, Jonah grabbed onto the ship's cargo bay and pulled himself inside. The doors slammed shut. Salith watched him escape, her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The transport ship raced through the upper atmosphere of Valkyris Prime, its engines roaring against the storm that still raged below. Jonah leaned against the cold metal wall of the cargo bay, his breath heavy, his muscles aching. The Queen's blade was still in his grip, its crimson gem pulsing faintly as if it, too, had just barely escaped destruction. Across from him, Dr. Lane stared with wide eyes. "Jonah," she finally said, voice shaking, "what in the world just happened down there?" Jonah exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But whatever that sword is, it woke something up. Someone." He thought of her. Queen Salith. The way she moved, the way her eyes burned with rage. She wasn't just some forgotten ruler. She was a force of nature. And now she was awake again because of him. Dr. Lane ran a hand through her hair. "We need to get off this planet. Now." But Jonah wasn't listening anymore. He could still feel Xylith's presence, like a shadow lurking at the edge of his mind. Even now, as they escaped, he knew she wasn't far behind. He wasn't wrong. Far below, taking a deep breath, he activated the airlock controls. The doors hissed open, revealing the dark abyss of space. The Sci-Fi warship was approaching fast. And then she appeared. Salith floated outside, her silver armor shimmering under the glow of distant stars. The void of space did not seem to affect her. She hovered effortlessly, her violet eyes locked onto Jonah. He stepped forward, standing at the edge of the airlock. "You came fast," he said. Salith tilted her head. "Did you think I would wait?" Jonah raised the sword. "If you want this, you're going to have to take it from me." For the first time, a glint of amusement crossed Salith's face. "Very well, human." In a blink, she launched toward him. Jonah barely had time to react before her fist slammed into his blade, sending a shockwave through the airlock. He stumbled back, barely managing to stay on his feet. Salith's speed was inhuman, faster than anything he had ever seen. She pressed forward, her strikes relentless. Jonah's body moved on instinct, blocking, dodging, countering. The sword guided him, but even with its power, he was barely keeping up. Salith's attacks were not wild. They were measured, precise. She was testing him. Then, with a swift motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisting him off balance. "You fight well for a thief," she murmured, "but you do not understand what you hold." Jonah gritted his teeth. "Then tell me." Salith hesitated. For a fraction of a second, Jonah saw something in her expression, a flicker of something more than just rage. But the moment passed. Salith's grip tightened. "Surrender the sword." Jonah exhaled. "I can't." Salith's violet eyes narrowed. "Then this will only end one way." And with that, the battle truly began. The battle in space had been nothing short of a storm. Jonah Calloway had barely escaped with his life, but he knew that Queen Salith would not stop hunting him. Now, sitting in the cockpit of a small stolen scout ship, Jonah stared at the crimson blade resting across his lap. The Queen's cursed sword, a weapon of war, a relic of power, and now his burden. His ship was drifting in the void of space, hidden among a field of broken asteroids. The escape had been desperate. He had barely managed to lose Salith's warship, but it wouldn't take long for her to track him again. Dr. Lane's voice crackled through the communicator. "Jonah, are you sure about this? We need to get back to human-controlled space." Jonah sighed. "If I go there, I'll be leading an angry alien queen right to them." "So what's your plan?" Jonah looked at the sword, running his fingers over the smooth, ancient metal. "I need answers." Dr. Lane hesitated. "And where exactly do you think you'll find those?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "The Sci-Fi rebels." Across the galaxy, the Sci-Fi Council was in chaos. The elders stood in their high chamber, their faces grim. The ancient rulers of their empire, once firm in their control, now felt fear creeping in. A warrior entered the chamber, bowing deeply. "My lords, Queen Salith has taken command of a fleet. She is hunting the human." The eldest council member clenched his jaw. "If she reclaims that sword fully, no one will be able to stop her." Another elder spoke in a low voice. "We must destroy the sword before it's too late." The first elder sighed. "And what of the human?" A pause. "Kill him as well." Jonah knew there was only one place where he might get the truth: the secret rebel hideout deep in the Yara Nebula. The Typharian rebels had been fighting against their own empire for years. They believed that the council had betrayed their own people by sealing Queen Salith away centuries ago. If anyone knew the truth about the sword, it was them. Jonah piloted his small ship through the swirling clouds of the nebula, his hands gripping the controls tightly. He had no guarantee that the rebels would help him. For all he knew, they might try to kill him too. The ship's scanner beeped, a signal. Before Jonah could react, a massive ship emerged from the mist, weapons pointed directly at him. His heart raced. A voice crackled through the comms. "Human, you have entered restricted space. Identify yourself." Jonah took a deep breath. "I have the Queen's blade." Silence. Then, after a moment, the voice returned. "Prepare to dock." The rebel base was hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid, its interior filled with Sci-Fi warriors dressed in old, mismatched armor. These were fighters who had been exiled, hunted, and forgotten. Yet they still carried the pride of their people. Jonah was led through the base until he stood before their leader, a tall, battle-worn Sci-Fi woman with piercing blue eyes. She studied him carefully. "You are the human who wields the Queen's blade." Jonah nodded. "I need to know the truth. Why did the sword choose me?" The rebel leader exhaled. "Because you were never meant to be just a thief." Jonah frowned. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the sword. "That weapon was not created for Queen Salith alone. It was meant to unite our people, not conquer them." Jonah's grip tightened on the hilt. "Then why is she trying to kill me?" The rebel leader's eyes darkened. "Because she has only known war. She does not understand that the sword has chosen a new path." Jonah felt a chill run through him. "And what if she refuses to accept that?" The leader sighed. "Then you must defeat her." Jonah swallowed hard. He had barely survived their first fight. How could he possibly defeat one of the greatest warriors in history? Before he could ask more, alarms blared through the base. A soldier rushed in, face pale. "She's here." Jonah's stomach dropped. The entire asteroid shook as something massive collided with its surface. The walls trembled, dust falling from above. Jonah didn't need to ask who it was. Scifi had found him. The rebel leader clenched her fists. "Get to the surface. We hold the line." Jonah ran, the sword in his grip as the rebels rushed to prepare for battle. As he reached the outer corridor, the wall exploded inward, sending metal shards flying. Jonah threw up his arms, shielding his face from the blast. And when he looked up, his heart nearly stopped. There she stood, Queen Scifi, her silver armor gleaming under the dim light, her violet eyes locked onto him with burning fury. Her voice was calm, but sharp as a blade. "There is nowhere left to run, human." Jonah's fingers tightened on the hilt. He had one last chance. This time, he had to stand and fight. The walls of the rebel base trembled as the shockwave from the explosion faded. Dust filled the air, and the smell of burnt metal lingered. Jonah coughed, shielding his eyes as he struggled to get back on his feet. And then, she stepped through the smoke. Queen Scifi, clad in her silver and black armor, her violet eyes glowing with fury, stood at the shattered entrance. Her long silver hair flowed behind her, moving like strands of liquid metal. Jonah's grip on the queen's blade tightened. His heart pounded. This was it. He could feel it. This was the moment where everything would be decided. The Axifarian rebels rushed to surround her, their weapons raised, but Scifi barely acknowledged them. She didn't need to. With a flick of her wrist, a wave of raw energy burst outward, sending the warriors flying back like dolls. Jonah took a step forward, forcing himself to stay firm. "You never stop, do you?" he muttered. Scifi's gaze was locked onto him, unblinking, unreadable. "You are holding something that does not belong to you." Jonah exhaled sharply. "It chose me." She tilted her head. "Then it is mistaken." Before Jonah could react, Scifi vanished. In less than a blink, she was right in front of him, her hand wrapping around his throat like a steel vise. She lifted him off the ground, her strength inhuman. Jonah gasped, his fingers prying at her grip, but she didn't flinch. Her violet eyes bored into his, her face inches from his own. "You are nothing but a thief," she whispered. "And I will correct this mistake." Jonah's lungs burned. He raised the queen's blade, swinging blindly, but Scifi caught his wrist with ease, holding him in place. She was toying with him. She wasn't just stronger. She was faster, sharper, more experienced. This wasn't a fight. This was a judgment, and she had already decided the outcome. Then, just as Jonah's vision blurred from lack of oxygen, something unexpected happened. The sword flared with light. Scifi flinched, just for a second, but it was enough. The blade pulsed, sending a shockwave between them. She released Jonah, stepping back, her expression suddenly uncertain. Jonah fell to the ground, gasping for air. He clutched the sword, its energy buzzing through him like lightning. Scifi's fingers twitched as she looked at her hand, as if something had shaken her. "Impossible," she murmured. Jonah struggled to his feet. "What's wrong, Your Highness?" he taunted, breathing hard. "Is your own sword rejecting you?" Her eyes snapped to his, filled with a fury unlike before. For the first time, Jonah saw something else in her gaze. Doubt. The truth hidden in the blade. The rebel leader, still struggling to get up after Scifi's earlier attack, coughed out, "Jonah, the sword, it is revealing something to her." Jonah frowned. "What does that mean?" The rebel leader looked toward Scifi, whose expression had turned from rage to confusion. "She is seeing the truth." Jonah felt a shift in the air. The energy around the sword wasn't just reacting, it was showing something. And then, the vision hit both of them at once. The room around them disappeared. Jonah was no longer in the rebel base. He was standing in the past, in a grand golden throne room. Sci-Fi warriors knelt before a younger Xylith, who stood tall, her armor gleaming, her expression proud but determined. Jonah heard voices, whispers from the past. A group of Sci-Fi nobles stood before her, their faces hard. "You have become too powerful," one of them said. "You are no longer fit to rule," another added. Then, betrayal. The nobles, the very people Xylith had trusted, sealed her away, locking her power within the sword itself. They had feared her, not because she was a tyrant, but because she had wanted to change their empire, to unite their enemies instead of destroying them. Jonah's mind spun. The history books had lied. Xylith wasn't just a conqueror. She had tried to end the cycle of war, but her own people had turned against her. And now, centuries later, the sword had chosen Jonah, because she could no longer fulfill the purpose it was meant for. The vision faded. Jonah gasped, suddenly back in the present. He turned to Xylith, who was standing in complete silence, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her own sword had shown her the truth. She wasn't the rightful owner anymore. And she knew it. A choice of fate. The room remained still. Jonah watched as Xylith lowered her hands, the fire in her eyes dimmed. For the first time, she looked lost. The truth had shaken her, but Jonah wasn't sure what that meant. Would she accept it, or would she fight anyway? He took a step forward, gripping the sword tightly. "It's over," he said. "You were betrayed. You're free now. But this sword, it's not yours anymore." Xylith didn't respond. She was caught between two worlds, the past she had known, and the truth she had just learned. Finally, after a long silence, she whispered, "You expect me to just let go?" Jonah exhaled. "You don't have to fight anymore." Her violet eyes met his. A storm raged within them, but Jonah could see it. The doubt, the uncertainty, and something else. Acceptance. But before either of them could say another word, an explosion rocked the base. The walls cracked, alarms blaring. The ground beneath them shook violently. A Sci-Fi rebel ran inside, shouting in panic, "The Sci-Fi Council has sent an attack force. They mean to destroy us all." Jonah's heart clenched. "They want to erase us." Xylith's hands curled into fists. And for the first time, she wasn't angry at Jonah. She was angry at them. She turned to him, her expression cold and unreadable. "Human." Jonah straightened. "Yeah." She took a slow breath. "Fight with me." Jonah's grip tightened on the sword. Then he nodded. And for the first time, human and queen stood side by side. The final battle had begun. The walls of the rebel base shook violently as another explosion ripped through its foundation. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the distant echoes of blaster fire and clashing metal filled the air. Jonah gripped the queen's blade, his heart pounding. The Sci-Fi Council's warships had arrived, sending an army of elite soldiers to wipe them out. Beside him stood Queen Xylith, her silver armor now tarnished with battle dust, but her violet eyes burned with a new fire. No longer fueled by vengeance, she was now driven by something greater, the truth. She had been betrayed by her own people, and now they sought to erase her from history, but she wouldn't let them. And neither would Jonah. They stood together. For the first time, human and queen were not enemies, but allies. The last battle begins. The rebel base's outer gates exploded, and Sci-Fi soldiers flooded inside, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Jonah barely had time to react before the first warrior lunged at him. His body moved on instinct, the queen's blade guiding him. He sidestepped the attack, swung his sword, and Kilash. Sparks flew as his blade met an enemy's spear, but Jonah was faster. He twisted, bringing his weapon down in a powerful arc, knocking the warrior back. To his right, Xylith moved like a storm, her twin blades slicing through the ranks of her enemies. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated. She was faster than all of them, cutting through their formation like lightning splitting the sky. The rebels fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. The council's forces were relentless, pressing forward with ruthless efficiency. Jonah's arms ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to fall. The sword's energy flowed through him, pushing him beyond his limits. But even with its power, he knew they were losing. A desperate gamble. Jonah's eyes darted toward the enemy flagship hovering above the battlefield. If they didn't disable that ship, reinforcements would keep coming. He turned to Salith. We have to take out their command ship. Salith didn't hesitate. Agreed. We go together. With a quick motion, she activated her wrist communicator, sending a coded signal to the remaining rebels. Hold the line. We end this now. Jonah and Salith broke into a sprint, cutting through enemy ranks as they pushed toward a captured Sci-Fi attack craft. Blaster fire rained around them, but they moved like a single force, deflecting shots, dodging strikes, unstoppable together. They reached the craft, and without a second thought, Jonah jumped into the pilot's seat. Salith sat beside him, her fingers dancing over the controls. The ship roared to life, and within moments, they were in the air, dodging enemy fire as they raced toward the command ship, storming the Council's flagship. The moment they landed inside the flagship's docking bay, Salith leaped out, her twin blades flashing. Jonah followed, cutting through guards as they pushed toward the bridge. The halls were lined with Sci-Fi elites, but Jonah and Salith fought with purpose. For every step they took, they cut down another enemy. Jonah could feel the blade's power growing, responding to his will. He wasn't just wielding the sword anymore. He was becoming one with it. They'd reached the bridge doors, and Salith slammed her palm onto the security panel. The doors hissed open, revealing the Sci-Fi Council, seated in their grand chamber. The elders stood slowly, their faces lined with centuries of command. One of them, the eldest, stepped forward. His cold gaze met Salith's. You should have remained buried, Queen. Salith's grip on her blades tightened. You stole my empire, you lied to my people, and now you would erase me. The elder sneered. You were a threat to our rule. We did what was necessary. Jonah felt a surge of anger. The council had never cared about their people. They had feared change, feared Salith's vision of peace. Salith's voice was calm, but filled with steel. Your reign ends today. The final clash. The council's elite guards attacked. The chamber erupted into chaos. Jonah charged forward, his sword clashing against an enemy's energy spear. Salith moved with deadly precision, her twin blades cutting through defenses like fire through dry grass. The elders watched in horror as their finest warriors fell before them. Jonah's breath came in short gasps, but he refused to fall. The sword burned with energy, his body moving as if it had done this 1,000 times before. And then, only the elders remained. One of them lunged desperately, but Jonah blocked with ease. With one swift strike, the battle was over. The council was defeated. The new dawn. Salith stood in the center of the silent chamber, her chest rising and falling as she surveyed the ruins of her past rulers. Then, slowly, she turned to Jonah. For the first time, there was no anger in her gaze. No vengeance. Only understanding. She looked at the queen's blade, still in Jonah's grip. And then, she knelt before him. Jonah's heart pounded. What are you doing? Salith's voice was calm, resolute. The sword has made its choice. Jonah felt a lump in his throat. You were its queen. Salith shook her head. No, I was a ruler of the past. You are the one who will shape the future. A silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Jonah reached out a hand. Stand with me, then. Salith's violet eyes softened. And then, she took his hand. Epilogue. A new era. With the council's rule shattered, the Sci-Fi Empire was reborn. Some called Jonah a warrior king, but he did not seek a throne. Instead, he stood beside Scylla, forging a new path, not as conquerors, but as leaders of change. And the Queen's blade, once a weapon of war, became a symbol of unity. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy had hope again.